In this intense story, a successful black CEO is falsely targeted by corrupt police officers who dismiss his authority and power based on racial biases. Despite his high status, he's subjected to unjust treatment, humiliation, and systemic racism, as officers wrongly assume he doesn't belong in elite spaces. The tension escalates as the protagonist faces the harsh reality of being judged by his race, regardless of his success. This gripping tale exposes the devastating impact of prejudice, offering a raw look at racism in America and the emotional toll of fighting back against injustice. The early morning sun filtered through the narrow blinds of Dr. Elijah Monroe's modest townhouse, casting faint golden stripes across the room. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint scent of eucalyptus from the diffuser in the corner. Elijah sat at the small kitchen table, his tablet propped against a stack of worn medical journals. He absent-mindedly stirred his coffee, reviewing patient charts, while soft jazz played in the background. For a man who had performed groundbreaking neurosurgeries and led international medical conferences, his surroundings were surprisingly understated. The furniture was functional, almost Spartan, well-maintained but far from luxurious. His home was filled not with expensive art, but with framed photographs of family gatherings and diplomas from universities that had catapulted him to the top of his field. The only overt indication of his wealth was the sleek black car parked in the driveway, a necessity more than a status symbol given the demands of his work. "Elijah, are you coming to the community clinic today?" His sister, Brianna, called from the living room, where she was folding clothes. She had moved in temporarily while recovering from a difficult divorce, her 2-year-old daughter now a joyful but noisy addition to the household. "I'm planning to stop by before heading to the hospital," Elijah replied, finishing his coffee. "They said they're short-staffed, and I promised to help." Brianna walked into the kitchen with a skeptical eyebrow raised. "You're doing rounds at one of the best hospitals in the country, yet you still find time to patch up sprained ankles in a clinic with peeling paint. You're a better person than me." Elijah chuckled softly. "If we don't take care of our own, who will?" The sincerity in his tone was as natural as the quiet way he carried himself. Elijah had worked hard to become one of the leading neurosurgeons in the country, but he'd never forgotten his roots. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had seen how systemic inequalities shaped lives. The clinic was more than a volunteer obligation. It was a promise he'd made to himself as a young man, one he intended to keep. By mid-morning, Elijah found himself standing in front of a gleaming storefront in one of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. He glanced at his watch before stepping into Ambrose Jewelers, a shop renowned for catering to an elite clientele. He wasn't much for material possessions, but today was special. It was his parents' 40th wedding anniversary, and he wanted to surprise them with something memorable. The cool air of the store was a stark contrast to the summer heat outside. The interior was immaculate, its polished marble floors reflecting the soft light from crystal chandeliers. Glass cases displayed an array of glittering treasures, diamond necklaces, gold watches, and sapphire earrings that seemed to whisper of extravagance. Elijah adjusted his tie, a simple navy one that complemented his tailored gray suit. Despite his unassuming demeanor, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to navigating high-pressure situations. He approached the counter where a young sales associate, a petite woman with a sharp bob and a name tag reading Claire, greeted him with a polite but distant smile. "Good morning," Elijah said warmly. "I'm looking for a gift for my parents' anniversary." Claire's smile tightened slightly, her eyes flickering briefly to the door, as though expecting someone else. "We have a selection of our most popular pieces over here," she said, gesturing to a case of modest jewelry. Elijah followed her, glancing down at the offerings. They were fine pieces, but none felt quite right. "I was hoping to see something more unique," he said. "Perhaps a custom piece?" Claire hesitated. "Custom orders typically start at a higher price point." Elijah smiled, undeterred. "That's fine. Could I see some options?" Her polite demeanor faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of doubt as she scanned his appearance. Despite his tailored suit and polished shoes, there was an unspoken skepticism in her gaze. Her voice dropped to a measured neutrality. "If you're looking for something within a specific budget, I can show you our mid-range collection." "I'm not concerned about the budget," Elijah interrupted gently, his tone calm but firm. I'd like to speak to the jeweler about a custom design. Claire hesitated again, her eyes darting toward an older man in the back of the store. He was watching the interaction with a furrowed brow, his body language suggesting an unspoken judgment. "Excuse me," Claire said hurriedly before disappearing into the back. Elijah exhaled slowly, his posture remaining composed, despite the irritation simmering beneath the surface. He had encountered moments like this too many times to count, subtle but unmistakable reminders that no matter his accomplishments, his skin color often spoke louder than his resume. A few moments later, the older man emerged, his expression one of polite disinterest. "I'm Mr. Ambrose," he said, extending a hand that was as perfunctory as his greeting. "I understand you're looking for a custom piece?" "That's right," Elijah said, shaking his hand. "It's for my parents' anniversary. I'd like something that reflects their love and resilience. A design with a personal touch." Ambrose's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Custom work is a significant investment. Are you sure that's what you're looking for?" Elijah's patience thinned but didn't snap. He reached into his pocket, producing a sleek business card, with his name and title embossed in silver. "I assure you, I can handle the cost." The older man glanced at the card, his eyes narrowing briefly, before his expression softened, a hint of embarrassment flickering across his face. "Of course, Dr. Monroe, I'll be happy to assist you personally." As Elijah left the store with a receipt for the custom design in hand, he felt the familiar sting of frustration mingled with exhaustion. Even in spaces meant to dazzle and delight, he was reminded of the barriers that lingered, invisible but ever present. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his phone. He answered on the second ring. "Elijah, it's Brianna. The clinic just called. They're swamped, and they've had a power outage. Can you swing by?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said without hesitation, shifting gears mentally as he headed toward his car. The community clinic stood in stark contrast to the luxury of the jewelry store. Its faded exterior was adorned with a hand-painted sign, and the waiting room was packed with patients from all walks of life. Despite its modest resources, the clinic hummed with an energy that spoke to its importance. Elijah stepped inside, greeted by the familiar chatter of overworked staff and the muffled cries of a child getting a tetanus shot. He rolled up his sleeves, his mind already racing through the list of patients who needed his attention. "Dr. Monroe, thank goodness you're here," said Carla, one of the nurses. "Room 3 has a concussion, and Mrs. Rodriguez in room 5 is asking for you specifically." "Got it," Elijah said, slipping into his natural rhythm. As he moved through the crowded space, he was greeted with smiles and handshakes. Here there was no doubt about his authority or expertise. His presence was a source of reassurance, a reminder that someone cared. In room 5, Mrs. Rodriguez, a longtime patient, gripped his hand tightly. "Dr. Monroe, you're a blessing," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't ever leave us." Elijah smiled, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." The day wore on, a blur of patients and diagnoses, but as Elijah finally locked up the clinic that evening, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The inequalities he faced daily, the assumptions, the dismissals, were heavy burdens, but they also fueled his determination to continue. He climbed into his car, the city lights twinkling against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, as he drove toward home, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The next morning began like any other for Dr. Elijah Monroe. He arrived at Westview General Hospital just as the first light of dawn broke over the skyline, the tall glass structure gleaming in the early sun. Despite its reputation as a hub for cutting-edge medicine, the hospital was not immune to the biases and inequalities that Elijah had spent his career combating. He knew this all too well. As Elijah entered the building, his crisp white coat slung over one arm, he nodded to the security guard stationed at the front desk. "Good morning, Henry," he said, his tone warm. The guard barely looked up. "Morning," he mumbled, his attention more focused on the tablet in his hands than on Elijah. It didn't faze him. After all, he had bigger things on his mind. His morning was packed with back-to-back surgeries, and by the time he finished, he would need to rush to the clinic to finalize a partnership with a non-profit organization that had offered to provide additional funding. Elijah thrived under pressure. But today, the air felt heavier, as if the world itself were daring him to trip. By mid-morning, Elijah was deep into a complicated spinal surgery, his hands steady as they navigated the delicate pathways of the human nervous system. His team worked like a well-oiled machine, their movements precise and synchronized. But as he sutured the final incision, a faint commotion outside the operating room drew his attention. Later, during his post-op review, he found out why. "Dr. Monroe, you've been asked to meet with the hospital's chief of staff," said a nurse in a low voice as she handed him the patient's chart. Her face betrayed nothing, but the way her eyes lingered on him suggested she was holding back more than she was letting on. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Now, is something wrong?" She hesitated before replying. "I think it's better if you hear it from him." The chief of staff's office was a pristine, intimidating space, dominated by dark wood and a large desk that seemed designed to dwarf whoever sat across from it. Dr. Gregory Wren, a tall, thin man in his early 60s, gestured for Elijah to take a seat. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was a tension in the air that immediately put Elijah on edge. "Elijah," Wren began, folding his hands, "I received a complaint this morning. A patient's family alleges that you were dismissive during your consultation with them last week." Elijah's brows furrowed. He carefully reviewed his mental archive of interactions. "Dismissive?" he asked. "I don't recall any interaction where that might have been the case. Which family is this?" Wren shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "They prefer to remain anonymous for now, but they described you as unapproachable and claimed they felt you didn't provide adequate information about their loved one's treatment plan." Elijah leaned back slightly, choosing his words carefully. "Dr. Wren, I take every patient and their family seriously. If they had concerns, I would have addressed them immediately. This feels unusual." The hesitation in Wren's demeanor deepened. "Be that as it may, we must consider all feedback seriously. I've scheduled you for a sensitivity training seminar next month." The words hung in the air, absurd and insulting. Elijah fought to maintain his composure, his mind racing. Sensitivity training. It was an implicit indictment, a suggestion that he lacked the empathy or professionalism required for his position. "I understand the importance of addressing concerns," Elijah said evenly, though his voice carried a hard edge. "But shouldn't we evaluate these claims with context? This feels more like an assumption than a fair assessment." "Dr. Monroe, let's not turn this into something it isn't," Wren said dismissively, his tone growing firmer. "We all have areas to improve. This seminar is non-negotiable." Elijah bit back a retort. He knew that pushing too hard would only reinforce the stereotypes he was already fighting against. Instead, he rose from his chair with measured calm. "Of course I'll add it to my schedule." Wren nodded, already looking back at his computer, signaling the conversation was over. But Elijah walked out of the office with his head high, vowing to uncover the truth behind the complaint. Later that afternoon, Elijah stopped by a cafe near the hospital to grab a late lunch. The line was long, and the space buzzed with the low hum of conversations and the whir of espresso machines. He glanced at his phone, responding to an email from the nonprofit organization he'd been liaising with. "Excuse me," a voice cut through his focus. Elijah looked up to see a middle-aged woman with a sharp bob and a sour expression standing in front of him. "The line starts back there," she said, pointing behind her. Elijah blinked in confusion. "I'm in line," he said, keeping his tone polite. The woman's gaze swept over him, lingering on his scrubs, as if they were a sign of inferiority. "Well, it looked like you were cutting ahead," she said sharply. Before Elijah could respond, the barista interjected. "Ma'am, he's been standing there for a while. I saw him." The woman flushed, but didn't apologize. Instead, she muttered something under her breath and turned away. Elijah inhaled deeply, forcing himself to let it go, but the knot of frustration in his chest tightened. It was a minor incident, but moments like these had a cumulative weight. They chipped away at his patience, a steady drip of microaggressions that reminded him how quickly people could diminish him to nothing more than an assumption. That evening, Elijah arrived at the clinic for the nonprofit meeting. He was greeted warmly by Carla, the head nurse, but her expression quickly turned serious. "Dr. Monroe, there's something you should know," she said. "A representative from the organization, well, let's just say she's been asking a lot of questions." Elijah frowned. "What kind of questions?" Carla hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "She wanted to know about our funding sources, our protocols. But then she asked if we'd ever had any issues with your professionalism. The knot in Elijah's chest twisted tighter. What did you tell her? Carla's voice hardened. I told her the truth, that you're the reason this clinic is still standing, but something about her tone, it didn't sit right. When the meeting began, Elijah quickly understood Carla's unease. The representative, a woman named Ms. Hanover, exuded a frosty professionalism that bordered on condescension. Her questions were pointed, her skepticism thinly veiled. Dr. Monroe, she said at one point, her pen tapping against her clipboard. Given your demanding schedule at Westview General, how do you ensure your work here doesn't compromise your performance there? The question was a loaded one, implying negligence without outright stating it. Elijah maintained his composure. I manage my time carefully, and I prioritize the needs of both my patients and this community. If you'd like, I can provide data on patient outcomes to demonstrate the clinic's success under my leadership. Her lips thinned into a tight smile. That won't be necessary for now. The tension in the room was palpable, but Elijah refused to let her bait him. He answered her remaining questions with precision and professionalism, determined not to give her any ammunition. As Elijah drove home that night, his mind raced with the events of the day. The complaint at the hospital, the encounter at the cafe, the pointed questions at the clinic, all of it painted a picture he knew too well. No matter his achievements, no matter his contributions, there were always those ready to question his place, to reduce him to a stereotype. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, the weight of his frustration pressing down on him. But he also knew that anger, though justified, wouldn't serve him here. He needed to act, not just for himself, but for the patients and colleagues who believed in him, for the community that relied on him. As he pulled into his driveway, Elijah took a deep breath. The fight ahead would require patience, strategy, and resilience, and he was ready. The first crack in the dam came early the next morning, when Elijah received an email from Westview General's HR department. The subject line read, Urgent, Administrative Review Meeting Scheduled. The message stated that he was to appear before the hospital's board later that week to address concerns regarding recent allegations. The vague language only added to the ominous tone. Elijah stared at the screen, his coffee forgotten and growing cold in his hand. Allegations. His mind raced through possibilities. Was this related to the anonymous complaint? Or had Ms. Hanover's pointed questions somehow escalated into something more damaging? The knot of frustration and dread in his chest tightened, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had faced adversity before and emerged stronger. This would be no different, he just needed to prepare. At the clinic, Elijah found Carla pacing in the hallway, her face a storm of worry. They called this morning, she said before Elijah could even greet her. The nonprofit is suspending funding until further notice. Ms. Hanover claimed there were irregularities in our operations. What irregularities? Elijah asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. Carla threw up her hands. She wouldn't say, just kept repeating that they needed to review their partnership. This is sabotage, Elijah. Plain and simple. Elijah's jaw tightened. He thought of the families who relied on the clinic, the patients who would now face delayed treatments and canceled appointments. The stakes were higher than ever, and someone was pulling the strings to undermine everything he'd worked for. That evening, Elijah met with Mitchell Green, a longtime friend and legal advocate who had always been a staunch ally. This is a coordinated attack, Mitchell said, leaning back in his chair as they sat in Elijah's modest living room. His voice was calm, but tinged with anger. They're stacking the deck against you at every level. First the hospital, now the clinic. Someone's trying to discredit you, and they're not being subtle about it. Elijah ran a hand over his face, his exhaustion evident. But why? I've kept my head down, done my job. I'm not some flashy figure stirring up controversy. You're a black surgeon running a community clinic that challenges systemic disparities, Mitchell countered. That's enough to make certain people uncomfortable. You're not just succeeding, you're proving their narrative's wrong, and that's dangerous to them. The weight of Mitchell's words hung heavily in the room. Elijah knew his friend was right, but knowing the why didn't make the fight ahead any easier. The night before the board meeting, Elijah sat at his desk, poring over records and crafting his defense: patient outcomes, community testimonials, and years of spotless performance reviews. All of it painted a picture of competence and dedication that no one could reasonably challenge. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that facts alone might not be enough. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Carla. "You should see this." She included a link to a news article. Elijah clicked on it, his stomach sinking, as the headline loaded. Westview surgeon accused of professional misconduct amidst growing allegations. The article cited anonymous sources and vague claims, painting him as an arrogant, dismissive doctor who prioritized ego over care. His hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just an attack on his career, it was a direct assault on his character. But as the initial wave of anger subsided, resolve began to harden within him. If they wanted to paint him as a villain, he would force them to confront the truth. The day of the board meeting arrived, and Elijah walked into the conference room with his head held high. The room was sterile, its long table surrounded by hospital administrators and board members who avoided meeting his gaze. Dr. Wren sat at the head, his expression unreadable. "Elijah," Wren began, his tone formal, "thank you for coming. We've convened this meeting to address the allegations raised against you." Elijah didn't flinch. "And what are these allegations exactly?" A murmur rippled through the room before Wren spoke again. "Several patients and their families have come forward, claiming you've shown a pattern of unprofessional behavior, being dismissive, overly critical, and at times, unapproachable." Elijah's eyes swept the room. "And where is the evidence to support these claims? I have served this hospital with integrity for over a decade. My patient outcomes speak for themselves, as do my colleagues' testimonials." Wren shuffled his papers. "The complaints are anonymous, which complicates verification." "Anonymous accusations?" Elijah interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "Do you realize how easy it is for someone to weaponize anonymity? This is not due process. It's a witch hunt." A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Before Wren could respond, Mitchell, who had accompanied Elijah as his legal representative, spoke up. "My client has prepared documentation that directly refutes these baseless claims," he said, distributing folders to the board. "What you're doing here is not only unjust, but could also expose the hospital to significant liability for defamation and discrimination." Wren's expression darkened, but he said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable. As Elijah left the meeting, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video Carla had sent it with the caption, "Look familiar?" He pressed play and immediately recognized Miss Hanover. She was at a small-town gathering, speaking candidly to a group of people. Her words chilled him. "We can't let people like Elijah Monroe take over. They pretend to care about the community, but it's all a front to push their agenda." The video ended with scattered applause from her audience. Elijah's blood boiled. This wasn't just a professional attack, it was personal, fueled by deep-seated prejudice. That evening, Elijah called an emergency meeting at the clinic. Carla, Mitchell, and a handful of trusted staff members gathered around the table as Elijah outlined his plan. "This isn't just about me anymore," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "They're targeting this clinic because it represents something they fear: equity, empowerment, and change. We're going to fight back." "How?" Carla asked, her skepticism clear, but her loyalty unwavering. Elijah held up the video. "This is our turning point. We expose the truth, not just about Hanover, but about the systems that enable people like her. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." The team worked late into the night, compiling evidence, reaching out to allies, and planning their next moves. As the hours ticked by, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just defending himself, he was standing up for the people who had been silenced for far too long. The cliffhanger came when Carla's phone buzzed with a notification. Her eyes widened as she read the message. "Elijah," she said, her voice trembling. "The video, it's been leaked, it's already trending." Elijah's heart raced as he processed the implications. The battle had just escalated, and the world was now watching. The morning after the video leak, the small world of Westview exploded. News outlets were already running the clip of Ms. Hanover's blatant discrimination on a continuous loop, and social media buzzed with outrage. While some rallied in support of Elijah and the clinic, others twisted the narrative, branding him a troublemaker or accusing him of exploiting the situation for attention. Elijah stood in his office at the clinic, phone in hand, watching the chaos unfold. Outside, a crowd had gathered. patients, supporters, and journalists mingling with protesters, holding signs that read, "Keep politics out of medicine," and "Monroe must go." The din of voices filtered in through the walls, a cacophony of anger, hope, and confusion. Carla burst through the door, her face flushed. "They're out there, Elijah," she said, barely catching her breath. "Protesters, reporters, even the cops. It's like the entire city decided to camp on our doorstep." Elijah set his phone down, rubbing his temples. This is exactly what they wanted, to turn this into a circus. "Then let's turn it into our circus," Mitchell said as he walked in, his expression grim but determined. "The video puts Hanover on the defensive, but it also paints a target on you. If we let them control the narrative now, it's game over." Elijah nodded, a fire flickering in his eyes. "We fight, Mitchell. We don't back down." Later that day, the first confrontation occurred. Elijah decided to step outside and address the crowd, hoping to diffuse tensions and clarify the situation. As he made his way through the clinic's main hall, he could feel the weight of every staff member's gaze. They trusted him to lead, to stand tall in the face of the storm. The moment he stepped onto the clinic's front steps, the crowd erupted. Supporters cheered, while protesters shouted slurs and accusations. A reporter shoved a microphone toward him. "Dr. Monroe, are you prepared to respond to the allegations against you in the clinic?" Before Elijah could speak, another voice cut through the chaos. "Step aside, please." It was Officer Daniels, a tall, broad man in his late 40s, flanked by two other officers. His presence sent a ripple through the crowd. "Dr. Monroe," Daniels said, his tone clipped, "we need to speak with you." Elijah stood his ground. "About what?" "We've received reports of irregularities in the clinic's operations," Daniels continued, his hand hovering near the badge on his chest. "We're conducting an investigation." "What kind of irregularities?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but firm. "That's confidential," Daniels replied, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "But we'll need you to come with us for questioning." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Carla rushed forward. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "It's fine, Carla," Elijah interrupted, raising a hand to stop her. "I have nothing to hide." As he allowed the officers to lead him away, cameras flashed, and voices shouted questions. The protesters' cheers mingled with the cries of his supporters, creating a chaotic symphony of noise. In the interrogation room, Daniels leaned back in his chair, his expression smug. "You know," he began, tapping a pen against the table, "I've seen your type before. Always thinking you're untouchable because of a fancy title or a degree." Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "And what type is that?" Daniels chuckled darkly. "The kind that thinks they can play hero while the rest of us clean up the mess." Elijah clenched his fists under the table, but kept his voice steady. "I'm here to serve my community. If that threatens someone, maybe they should examine their own motives." The officer's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Let's talk about these supposed irregularities at your clinic." "What irregularities?" Elijah shot back. "The same ones your department failed to provide any evidence for before dragging me out of my workplace?" Daniels leaned forward, his tone dropping. "Careful, Dr. Monroe arrogance won't get you out of this." Meanwhile, outside the station, Carla and Mitchell held an impromptu press conference. "This is blatant harassment," Mitchell declared, his voice echoing across the gathered crowd. "Dr. Monroe has dedicated his life to helping underserved communities. The only thing he's guilty of is being too good at what he does, and making certain people uncomfortable because of it." Reporters scribbled furiously as Carla added, "The timing of this so-called investigation is no coincidence. It's an attempt to discredit a man who has exposed systemic issues that others want to keep hidden." As the press conference gained traction, a few familiar faces emerged from the crowd. Former patients of the clinic, one by one. They stepped forward to share their stories, painting a picture of the compassionate care Elijah had provided. Back inside, Daniels seemed to sense that his intimidation tactics were failing. "I'm not going to play your game," Elijah said firmly, his calm demeanor infuriating the officer. "If you have legitimate concerns about my clinic, follow due process, but don't think for a second that I'll let you use me as a scapegoat." Daniels stared at him for a long moment, before finally relenting. "You're free to go," he said, his tone begrudging. As Elijah walked out of the station, the crowd erupted in applause. He paused at the top of the steps, his presence commanding attention. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "It's about fighting for a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity, and I won't stop fighting." The crowd roared in response, their cheers mingling with the flashes of cameras. That night, Elijah gathered his closest allies at his home to plan their next move. "We have to be strategic," Mitchell said, pacing the room. "They'll keep coming at you, trying to chip away at your credibility." "But now the spotlight is on them too," Carla countered. "The video, the arrests, the harassment, it's all starting to backfire. People are waking up." Elijah nodded, his mind racing. "Then we push harder. We shine a light on everything they've tried to keep hidden. Every discriminatory policy, every unjust practice. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." As the group strategized late into the night, the tension in the room was palpable. They knew the stakes were higher than ever, but they also knew they had the truth on their side. The cliffhanger came when Carla received a notification on her phone. Her eyes widened as she read it. "Elijah," she said, her voice trembling. "A whistleblower just came forward. They're ready to expose everything." The dimly lit auditorium of Westview's Civic Center buzzed with a tense energy. The video of Ms. Hanover's bigoted tirade had ignited a media firestorm, and the emergency town hall meeting she'd called in response was the epicenter of the controversy. Reporters lined the walls, cameras ready to capture every second, while rows of community members filled the seats, their faces a mix of outrage, curiosity, and exhaustion. Elijah Monroe stood at the back of the room, observing the scene he'd debated whether to attend, knowing he'd likely become the target of Hanover's deflection tactics. But this wasn't just about him, it was about his community, his patients, and the clinic that had become a lifeline for so many. Beside him, Mitchell Green adjusted his tie, scanning the room. "This is going to be a circus," he muttered. "Are you sure about this?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Absolutely." Ms. Hanover took the stage, flanked by a group of stern-faced individuals, a mix of her staunch supporters and representatives from the non-profit board. Her smile was tight, her usual composure visibly strained under the weight of the scandal. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calculated and saccharine. "I've called this meeting to address the recent misinformation being spread about my intentions and our partnership with the Monroe Clinic." Elijah's fists clenched at the word misinformation. He exchanged a glance with Carla, who sat near the front, her expression mirroring his frustration. "Our organization has always prioritized fairness and accountability," Hanover continued. "But in recent weeks, baseless accusations have sought to tarnish our reputation. I'm here to set the record straight." As she spoke, her eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on Elijah. A flicker of disdain crossed her face before she masked it with a practiced smile. "Elijah Monroe," she said, her voice shifting into an accusatory tone, "while undoubtedly talented, has shown a concerning disregard for the ethical guidelines our partnership requires. It's this disregard that forced us to reevaluate our relationship with the clinic." A murmur swept through the audience. Elijah felt the heat of every gaze turning toward him. He rose slowly, his presence commanding attention without needing to speak. Mitchell placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, but didn't stop him. "Elijah," Hanover addressed him directly now, her tone dripping with false concern. "Would you care to explain the allegations against you? Or perhaps clarify the inconsistencies in your clinic's financial reports?" The bait was clear, but Elijah refused to rise to it. Instead, he stepped forward, his calm demeanor cutting through the tension. "I'd be happy to clarify," he said, his voice steady and strong. "But first, let's talk about your statements, Ms. Hanover, the ones caught on video." The crowd gasped, and the energy in the room shifted sharply. Hanover's mask of control faltered for a moment, before she recovered. "That video," she said quickly, "was taken out of context. It was a private conversation, twisted to serve a narrative that undermines the good work we do." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Twisted?" "Your words were clear. You referred to people like me as a threat. You implied that my work in this community was some kind of agenda. Tell me, Ms. Hanover, what exactly is threatening about providing healthcare to underserved populations?" Her supporters shifted uncomfortably, but Hanover doubled down. My concerns have always been about transparency and accountability, Dr. Monroe. If you can't see that. Transparency? Elijah interrupted, his voice rising just enough to command the room. Let's talk about transparency. Then, let's talk about how you funneled funds away from community programs into pet projects that serve your donors. Let's talk about the sudden audits and anonymous complaints against my clinic. Complaints that conveniently began after you started questioning my leadership. Hanover's face turned pale, her composure cracking. Those accusations are baseless, she snapped. You have no evidence? Oh, but I do. Elijah nodded to Carla, who stood and handed a folder to Mitchell. He stepped forward, addressing the room. This, Mitchell announced, holding up the folder, is a detailed report of financial discrepancies linked to Ms. Hanover's organization. It includes redirected funds, questionable expenses, and a pattern of targeting minority-led initiatives. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, and the crowd murmured loudly. Hanover's supporters looked visibly shaken, some whispering among themselves. Hanover's voice cut through the noise, shrill and desperate. This is a smear campaign. He's trying to discredit me because he can't handle scrutiny. Scrutiny? Elijah said, stepping closer to the stage. What I can't handle is someone like you weaponizing prejudice to undermine the work this community depends on. You don't want accountability. You want control. And when you couldn't control me, you tried to destroy me. Hanover's eyes darted toward her allies, seeking support, but their expressions had shifted. The tide was turning, and she knew it. In the midst of the confrontation, a woman in the audience stood up. She was older, her face lined with years of resilience, and her voice carried authority as she spoke. I'm Ruby Henderson, she announced. I've been a patient at the Monroe Clinic for 5 years. Dr. Monroe and his team saved my life when no one else would. I'm here today because of him. More voices joined hers, one after another. A young father spoke about how the clinic had treated his son's chronic asthma when insurance wouldn't cover it. A college student shared how Elijah had helped her find affordable mental health care. Each testimony chipped away at Hanover's facade. By the time they finished, her silence was deafening. Elijah turned back to Hanover, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. This isn't about me, Ms. Hanover. It's about the people you've ignored, the lives you've deemed unworthy of support. They deserve better than your excuses. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Hanover. She opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again, realizing she had nothing left to say. The climax reached its peak when one of Hanover's former employees stepped forward, a laptop in hand. I think the people deserve to see this, he said, projecting an email exchange onto the screen behind him. The emails revealed Hanover's blatant efforts to sabotage Elijah's clinic, including directives to delay funding and spread false complaints. The final email, dated just days before the video leak, read, "We need to make an example of him. Otherwise, they'll think they can get away with anything." The room exploded. Hanover's remaining supporters abandoned her, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. The non-profit board members exchanged furious whispers, clearly blindsided. Elijah stood tall amidst the chaos, his presence a beacon of strength. But even as the crowd rallied behind him, he knew the battle wasn't over. The damage Hanover had caused wouldn't be undone overnight, and the fight for justice was far from finished. As the town hall concluded, a reporter approached Elijah with a microphone. "Dr. Monroe, what's your next move?" Elijah looked directly into the camera, his voice calm but resolute. "We rebuild not just the clinic, but the trust and dignity this community deserves, and we hold those in power accountable for every lie, every injustice, and every life they've tried to diminish." The screen cut to black, leaving the audience with a sense of both triumph and anticipation for what was to come. The heavy rain blurred the flashing lights of the police cruisers parked haphazardly outside the community center. The storm mirrored the chaos inside Elijah Monroe's mind as he stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his face taut with determination. The news had spread like wildfire. Another confrontation involving Officer Daniels, this time escalating into an unjustified raid on the very clinic Elijah had fought so hard to protect. The sight of Daniels near the clinic's entrance ignited a fire in Elijah's chest. The officer's smug posture, The arrogant tilt of his chin as he directed his officers spoke volumes. For Daniels, this wasn't just enforcement, it was a display of dominance. Elijah clenched his fists, his calm demeanor cracking. As Elijah approached, Daniels caught sight of him and smirked. "Dr. Monroe," he called out mockingly, his voice cutting through the rain like a knife. "What brings you out on this fine evening here to check on your little charity case?" Elijah's voice was steady, but firm. "I'm here to make sure you don't hurt anyone else tonight." Daniels took a slow step forward, his boots splashing in the puddles. "Hurt anyone? No, Dr. Monroe, I'm just enforcing the law. You see, there's been some suspicion of, what was it, fraudulent practices at your clinic, tax evasion, misuse of funds. The list goes on." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You mean, fabricated charges, manufactured evidence? You've been gunning for this moment for months, Daniels? Don't pretend this is about justice." Daniels's smirk widened. "Oh, it's about justice, all right? People like you?" "Say it," Elijah interrupted sharply, stepping closer. "Go ahead and say what you mean, Officer Daniels. People like me, black men, who dare to stand tall, who refuse to bow." The crowd around them shifted uneasily, murmurs rippling through the onlookers. Daniels hesitated for a fraction of a second, his composure slipping, before doubling down. "You think you're untouchable, because you're some big-shot doctor," Daniels spat. "But the law doesn't care about your degrees or your clinic, you're just another name on a file to me." The venom in his words hung heavy in the air. Elijah felt the weight of every injustice he had faced. The slights, the assumptions, the systemic barriers, all condense into this moment. But instead of lashing out, he drew a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "You've overstepped," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the rain. "You and I both know there's nothing illegal happening at my clinic. This isn't about law enforcement. This is about your power trip, about making an example of me because I refuse to stay silent." Daniels stepped closer, their faces now inches apart. "Watch your tone, doctor," he snarled. "You think you can lecture me? You don't know the first thing about the pressure we face. And you don't know the first thing about the people you claim to protect," Elijah fired back. "These people aren't criminals. They're families, children, seniors. They're the backbone of this community, the very people you're supposed to serve." Daniel's face darkened, his hands twitching at his sides. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Enough!" Mitchell Green, Elijah's lawyer and ally, stepped forward, holding his phone high. "I've recorded everything, Officer Daniels. Your words, your threats, every single one of them. You're not just incriminating yourself, you're incriminating your department." Daniels faltered, his bravado wavering as he glanced at the phone. "You think that little video's going to scare me? I've got the law on my side." "And I've got the truth on mine," Elijah said firmly. "Let's see how your department feels about having its dirty laundry aired in court." As the confrontation escalated, Carla pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with urgency. "Elijah," she said, her voice trembling, "they've locked the clinic's doors, patients are still inside, one of them needs urgent care." Elijah turned back to Daniels, fury blazing in his eyes. "This isn't just negligence, it's endangerment. You've crossed the line." Daniels sneered. "I'll cross whatever line I need to enforce the law." But before Daniels could gloat further, one of his own officers stepped forward, her expression troubled. "Sir," she said quietly, "the patient's inside. This isn't protocol. We're not supposed to block access to medical care." Daniels whipped around, glaring at her. "Fall in line, Officer Hayes. That's an order." But Hayes didn't move. Instead, she met Elijah's gaze, her eyes filled with conflicted determination. "Dr. Monroe," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "I need to know if anyone inside is in critical condition." Elijah nodded. "A diabetic patient. Her insulin levels are dangerously low. She needs immediate treatment." Hayes hesitated, glancing between Daniels and Elijah, before stepping toward the clinic. "I'll get her out." Daniels erupted. "Hayes, don't you dare!" "I took an oath to protect and serve," Hayes shot back, her voice trembling but firm. "That includes the people in there." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as Hayes marched past Daniels, unlocking the clinic doors. The moment marked a crack in Daniel's control, a shift in the power dynamic he had so desperately clung to. While Hayes escorted the patients to safety, Elijah turned back to Daniels. "Your own officers are rejecting your orders. What does that say about your leadership?" Daniels's face contorted with rage. "You think you've won, this isn't over." "No," Elijah replied, stepping even closer. "It's just beginning." Daniels's next move was as desperate as it was predictable. He reached for Elijah, gripping his arm tightly in a blatant show of force. But before he could escalate further, the crowd surged forward, their voices united in protest. "Let him go!" "You're out of line, Daniels." Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos. "If you don't release him right now, I'll have every lawyer in the state on this case by morning." Daniels froze, his grip loosening as he realized the futility of his actions. Slowly, he let go, his face twisted with frustration. The confrontation reached its peak when a journalist stepped forward, holding a folder of documents. "Officer Daniels," she announced, her voice sharp, "these internal reports were just leaked care to comment on the accusations of misconduct filed against you over the past 5 years?" Daniels' composure shattered. He stammered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the evidence. The crowd erupted again, their voices demanding justice, as the journalist continued pressing him with questions. Elijah stood tall amidst the chaos, his presence a beacon of resilience. But even as the crowd rallied around him, he knew this wasn't the end. The fight for systemic change would be long and grueling, and Daniels was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. As the night wore on and the crowd began to disperse, Elijah found himself standing alone in the rain. Mitchell approached, his voice quiet but resolute. "You've got the upper hand now, Elijah. What's the next step?" Elijah looked toward the clinic, his sanctuary, now battered but still standing. "We rebuild," he said softly. "We hold them accountable, and we keep fighting. Because this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced." The rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of the confrontation, but leaving its impact indelibly etched in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. The days following the confrontation outside the clinic moved in a blur. Elijah Monroe spent countless hours at his clinic, coordinating with lawyers, journalists, and community leaders to ensure that everything was documented and accounted for. Mitchell had already begun preparing a formal legal challenge, while the leaked documents about Officer Daniels' history of corruption and misconduct had gone viral, sparking outrage both locally and nationally. But even as the media storm raged on, Elijah knew this fight was far from over. It was only the beginning. The first domino to fall came when Daniels was placed on administrative leave, a move that sent ripples through the department. It wasn't enough. Elijah knew that the department's internal investigation would likely whitewash the incident, but it was a start. Every small victory was a step closer to exposing the full depth of the corruption that had stained the badge. Elijah's phone buzzed. It was Carla. "We need to talk. Meet me at the clinic, please." By the time Elijah arrived, the place was filled with journalists, community members, and activists, all demanding change. The clinic had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for those who had long been silenced. It was a strange feeling. This was the very same clinic that had once seemed like a small, personal sanctuary for Elijah's patients. Now, it was a battleground. But that was exactly why he had fought for it. Carla was standing at the front, her arms folded across her chest, a look of concern etched across her face. She had been Elijah's right hand throughout the ordeal, and though she was always pragmatic, there was a fire in her eyes now, one that matched his own. "Elijah," she said, her voice low, "we're getting calls from all over. People want to know what happens next. You've made a difference, but there's more to do. This isn't just about taking down one officer." Elijah nodded, his fingers tightening around the doorframe. "I know Daniels is just a symptom of a much larger disease, but if we don't hold him accountable, we can't move forward. It's the only way we can make real change." Carla stepped closer, her gaze steady. "I'm with you, but we need a plan. Right now, Daniels is on the defensive. But what happens when the system closes ranks around him? What happens if they try to turn this back on you?" The thought weighed heavily on Elijah's mind. They can't take back the truth. Daniels has too much dirt on him now, and the community knows that they can't silence us this time. The next morning, a press conference was scheduled, and for the first time in weeks, Elijah allowed himself a moment of rest. It wasn't much, but he had earned it. He sat at the desk in his office, staring at the photograph on the wall. A picture of his late mother, smiling proudly as she stood in front of the clinic when it had first opened. He had promised her he would make a difference in this world. A promise that he had no intention of breaking. When the press conference began, Elijah stepped up to the podium, flanked by Mitchell and Carla. The room fell silent. Flashbulbs popped, microphones were raised. Elijah looked out over the sea of journalists, his heart steady in his chest. "We've all seen the footage," he began, his voice calm but powerful. "And we've all read the reports. Officer Daniels has been a threat to this community for far too long. He is not a hero. He is not a protector. He is a man who abused his power and violated the very principles he swore to uphold." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I am here today to tell you that this is only the beginning. The fight for justice is not over. But together, we can make sure that people like Daniels never again have the power to destroy lives." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the room palpable. Mitchell stepped forward, speaking about the legal challenges Daniels would face, while Carla addressed the support of local activists, detailing how they would work to bring the community together in the coming months. It was a powerful message, a reminder that this wasn't just one man's fight, but a collective struggle for equality, accountability, and reform. The fallout for Daniels came swiftly. A state investigation was launched into his actions, and more whistleblowers came forward. Officers who had witnessed his misconduct, who had been too afraid to speak up before the documentary footage of the clinic raid was aired nationwide, sparking protests and calls for action from civil rights groups. The tide was shifting, and Elijah had become an unwitting figurehead in the movement for police reform. But even as Daniel's world began to crumble, Elijah knew that the victory, however hard won, was still incomplete. The system that had allowed someone like Daniels to operate with impunity would not change overnight. He wasn't naive, but for the first time in years, he felt that the balance of power had shifted. The community was awake, and the fight for justice had gained a new momentum. It wasn't long before the first of the systemic changes began to take shape. The mayor's office announced new policies to address police accountability, while the state attorney general's office pledged to review all complaints of police misconduct that had been ignored or mishandled. Elijah, though still wary of the promises, couldn't ignore the signs that reform might actually be possible. But change would require vigilance, and Elijah wasn't ready to rest yet. One afternoon, Elijah met with Carla and Mitchell to discuss the next steps. They sat around the same table where they had planned the initial protest months ago, the one that had sparked it all. "We need to think bigger," Elijah said, his fingers tapping on the table. "This isn't just about one police officer. This is about a culture of fear, silence, and broken systems. We can't let this moment pass without pushing for more." Mitchell leaned forward. "What are you suggesting?" "We start building a coalition," Elijah said, his eyes bright with determination. "We work with the community, with other clinics, with organizations that support families, immigrants, and marginalized groups. We don't just change one policy, we change the way this city functions, from the ground up." Carla nodded in agreement. "We can't let this become just a story. We need this to be the beginning of a larger movement." Weeks later, after the dust had settled somewhat from the chaos, Elijah stood at the front of a town hall meeting, looking out at the diverse crowd before him. The room was packed, filled with people who had come to support the cause, to speak out, to make sure that the changes they had fought for didn't disappear with the next scandal. It was a slow, often painful process, but it was also beautiful. In its persistence, Elijah had seen firsthand how the community had come together in ways he hadn't expected. His clinic was a microcosm of that unity. The power of one person's voice, he realized, was amplified when others stood in solidarity. The struggle wasn't over, far from it, but for the first time in his life, Elijah felt the pulse of hope. Real hope. Not because things were perfect, but because they could be, and he would keep fighting until they were. As Elijah Monroe walked through the now bustling halls of his clinic, the weight of everything that had transpired over the past few months settled on him like a quiet storm. The walls were lined with photos, faces of the people whose lives he had touched, each one representing a chapter of his journey. He paused in front of one photo in particular, a smiling young woman who had come in years ago for a routine checkup, but had later confided in him about her struggles with systemic injustice. Her story, like so many others, had stayed with him. It was one of the first moments he realized how deeply interconnected the personal and the political were. He wasn't the same man who had opened this clinic, or the same man who had taken that fateful walk across the street that morning in the rain, unaware of how his life, and the course of his community, was about to change. Elijah had always been driven by the desire to heal, to offer solace and care where it was needed most. But now, as the clinic continued to serve as a sanctuary, it was also becoming a symbol of resistance. His resilience had sparked something larger than himself, a movement that refused to allow injustice to take root. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Carla, his partner in both the fight and the vision. "We've got a meeting with the mayor's office at 3. It's time to talk about the next steps." His chest tightened with anticipation, but there was no fear anymore. There had been times when he questioned if he could handle the weight of the truth he had uncovered, or whether he was strong enough to keep pushing when the system fought back with every tool it had. But now, after everything, the protests, the leaks, the revelations about Officer Daniels, the rallying of the community, Elijah knew that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. His inner strength was no longer just a quiet resolve. It had become an unshakable belief that progress was possible, that change was real, and that his voice, his actions, could help lead the way. In the months that followed Daniel's fall from grace, Elijah became more than just a figurehead of the movement. He became its heartbeat. His story, the story of a black man who had fought back against a system designed to suppress him, had galvanized an entire city. People were no longer just talking about reform, they were demanding it. From police accountability to fair housing practices, to a broader acknowledgement of racial disparities in healthcare and the legal system, the calls for change were louder than ever. At first, the public attention had felt overwhelming, but Elijah had learned to channel it. He had learned to listen deeply to the stories of those who had been marginalized for so long. He had learned that, for every person he helped heal in his clinic, there were countless others who needed someone to stand up for them in a different way. His journey had transformed him from a healer of bodies to a healer of systems. But with this new role came a deep understanding of the complexity of the struggle he had witnessed firsthand, how easily the system could co-opt the language of reform while maintaining its grip on power. He knew that while the fall of Officer Daniels was a victory, it was not a panacea. The work was never going to be easy. The institutions that upheld injustice were deeply rooted, and their influence reached far beyond the police department. Elijah was no longer just fighting for one person or one family. He was fighting for entire generations of people who had been denied justice simply because of who they were. The events surrounding Officer Daniels had peeled back the curtain on the hidden world of systemic racism, corruption, and abuse of power that so many had endured in silence. In the wake of Daniels' arrest, a flood of stories came to light. Stories of individuals whose lives had been destroyed by officers like him, whose voices had been ignored because of their race, their gender, or their class. The media coverage spread beyond Elijah's clinic and beyond their city. It reached cities across the country, lighting a spark that could not be extinguished. Activists, educators, lawyers, and ordinary citizens began to see that they, too, had a role to play in the fight for justice. What had begun as a personal quest for accountability had become part of a larger national movement. But Elijah knew that the real change would not be televised, nor would it always be easy to see. It would be in the quiet moments, when community members came together to make their voices heard at city council meetings, or when an ordinary person decided they could no longer remain silent. Change, Elijah had learned, was often built not in the dramatic confrontations, but in the sustained, collective effort of people who refused to let injustice continue unchecked. Through it all, Elijah had remained grounded in the belief that true healing could only come when the system itself was addressed, when power was shared equitably, and when those who were marginalized were given the tools and the space to fight for themselves. He had witnessed the incredible resilience of his community, and it was that same resilience that had carried him through the darkest days of the fight. He now realized that the clinic was no longer just a place for healing physical wounds. It had become a hub for collective healing, a space for people to fight for their futures, together. As Elijah sat in the meeting with the mayor's office, the conversation centered on the future of law enforcement reform. There was talk of new policies, more rigorous oversight, and community engagement. But beneath the formal discussions, Elijah could see something else: a deep, collective desire for change. It wasn't just about one policy or one officer anymore. It was about a new vision for the city, one in which everyone, regardless of their background, could thrive without fear of discrimination or violence. When the meeting concluded, the mayor's office had committed to a set of reforms that, while not perfect, promised a new direction. Elijah walked out of the room with Carla and Mitchell, the weight of the meeting heavy on his shoulders, but the sense of possibility still burning bright within him. He knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a long journey toward a truly just society. But for the first time, he felt hopeful about what could come next. Elijah's growth, his resilience in the face of adversity, had not just changed the trajectory of his own life, it had become a beacon of hope for others. The community that had stood by him and supported him had become a force in its own right. They had shown that when people come together, they can challenge the systems that oppress them, and they can demand a future that is more just, more equitable, and more compassionate. As Elijah stood in front of his clinic once again, watching the sunset cast its golden light over the city, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long, and the battles would continue. But in the quiet of the evening, he knew something fundamental had shifted. The people of his community had found their voices, and as long as they stood together, their fight for justice would not be silenced. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world and the hope of the future resting on his shoulders. The struggle wasn't over, but as long as he had the strength to fight, and as long as others were willing to join him, there was always the possibility for change. He didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: he would keep fighting, for justice, for equality, and for the world his community deserved. And for the first time, he wasn't alone.